So welcome back. I want to look briefly at this question of objective and relative ethics. And there's been some good discussion, but always there are some issues that come up that I think we need to be more specific about and clarify and look back at the beginning of the course, some of the things we learned there, because these are some pretty common mistakes to start with, and then we'll pull in a few other things. The common errors, students often forget the difference between normative and prescriptive when we talk about ethics. When we talk normatively, we're talking about what you see happening, what people do. When we talk about prescriptive, we're talking about what people ought to do. And there's an error of argumentation that people think because some people do different things, that proves that ethics are relative. But that's really not any proof of anything. Like if you've read the Ruth Benedict article, she makes it sound like, well, look at all these different cultures, they have different ethics. Therefore, ethics are relative to the culture, they're culturally relative. Well, that's a normative description. That doesn't answer the question of, are there some things that are wrong for everybody, even if some people don't recognize them as wrong? Every objective ethicist is going to say, it doesn't matter if 90% of the world's population says this thing is wrong, this thing is still wrong, whether 90% of the population says it is or says it's not. For instance, we might say it's wrong to torture an innocent person to death. Right? If that's wrong for everyone, everywhere, at all times, in all places, it doesn't matter if 90% of the Earth's population think it's okay. It's still wrong. That's what an objective ethicist is saying. So the idea that, oh, but some people do that, does not bring an argument against an objective ethicist. They're going to say, so what? Some people thought the Earth was flat, and it wasn't. So this is important to keep in mind. Are we talking prescriptively or normatively? And an objective ethicist is going to say, if there are 300 different ways of saying whether or not murder is right or wrong, doesn't matter. Murder is still wrong. And we have an obligation to figure out what's murder and what's not, when it's wrong, when it is murder, because murder is by definition wrong, and what killing is not murder. Or is there a killing that's not murder? We have an obligation to figure that out. Like Socrates talks about, the unexamined life is not worth living. We have an obligation to examine what we do, when we do it, why we do it. So that's what an objective ethicist is saying. Another thing to remember from the very beginning of the course is the difference between morals, laws, and customs. If you think of a Venn diagram, right? These are realities, whether you, people think, oh, customs, we try to overlap and we try to think they're all the same thing. But they're not, and here's why that's important to keep in mind. Because for an objective ethicist, we can make the argument that a law is immoral. Jim Crow laws in the South in the 50s, they were wrong, they were evil, they were bad. They're not good laws because they're immoral laws. That's what it means to be an objective ethicist. There can be a bad law. And we'll get more to that in just a minute as well, because that creates problems for relative ethicists. Laws and customs can be neutral or wrong or good and right. They can be any one of those three or a combination. So, we have a law that you should drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's based in a custom. We drive on the right-hand side of the road. England has a law that you drive on the left-hand side of the road. That's based in a custom. And it's settled into law. That custom was made law, and so. But the morals say you should be concerned about the well-being and the safety of others when you're driving a car. Therefore, morally, you should obey the law and drive on the right-hand side of the road. That's the moral. Now, if you're driving an emergency vehicle and you have on your sirens and the right-hand side of the road is blocked, you have the exception available to you to, when it is safe and people are obeying your sirens, to pull over into the left-hand side of the road to get around the blocked up traffic to continue making it to the emergency. Because the point of the law is that life is important and we should do what we can to preserve and save life. That's the moral. The customs, the laws are meant to work to uphold or work alongside the morals. Some customs have nothing to do with morals, right? We have turkey on Thanksgiving. There's nothing moral or immoral about that, unless you're, an avid vegetarian who thinks it's wrong to kill animals. But that aside for a moment, typically that's not a moral thing in the sense of, my family can celebrate celebrate Thanksgiving with turkey. Yours may celebrate with, lamb chops. I don't know. I mean, that's nobody's gonna arrest you for that. It's not a law. It's not moral or immoral. It just is a custom. But some customs can be made laws or affect laws. Some customs can be rooted in morality, or connected to morality. But they're not all the same thing. So keep that in mind. Another clear and important distinction we need to make. Pojman makes it in his article. In the textbook, you need to read, I think it starts around page 38, you need to read that chapter that he writes. He's the editor of the textbook, but he also writes one of the chapters on objective ethics. He does a great job of laying out all these distinctions and definitions. You need to read that. But he talks about how objective ethics are not necessarily absolute ethics. Frequently students will say, I've seen some on the discussion board say, objective ethics means that there's absolutely one right law for everything. That's not objective ethics. That's absolutism. Absolutism says there's a list of laws and there's an exact law for everything, an exact law for or against anything that's right or wrong, and you have to follow that exact law. Objectivism says there's at least one thing or a few things that are always wrong for everybody, everywhere, throughout history, no matter what, even if people don't understand that to be the case. But there may be a variety of ways to uphold that moral. And there may be a variety of ways to violate that moral. It's not just one rule. And in fact, an objectivist is going to say, I have an obligation to examine what we do and why, and make sure it works in each situation, right? I need to find what's just in the situation based on the larger principles of what is always wrong and what is always right. That's objectivism versus absolutism. Here's a list of rules, and if you keep all these rules, you're good to go. Another thing to keep in mind is relativism. Cultural relativism on some level always degrades into subjectivism. Cultural relativism means that the culture sets the rules. Subjectivism means that each individual has all their own rules and nobody can say anything about anybody else's rules. If cultural relativism is true, then subjectivism ultimately becomes true. And the problem with both of those is if relativism and or subjectivism are true, there's no such thing as a moral hero. At best, a moral hero is just a nuisance. Because if the culture determines what's right, then what we would usually call a moral hero, the person who's telling the culture they're wrong, just becomes a nuisance. Take, for instance, if there were Germans, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of my heroes. He was a German who told the Nazis, you're wrong for killing the Jews. He died for that. Well, that's moral heroism. But if the culture sets the rules, then it was right it was fine, because all the Nazis said they should kill the Jews. And it would be, I mean, how are you going to tell them they're wrong? Because that's their culture, that's their cultural norm, that's their rule. And Bonhoeffer just becomes a jerk and a nuisance. Same for Mahatma Gandhi in India. He's a moral hero if there are objective ethics. He's a nuisance if it's all cultural. Another thing to keep in mind is if the relativist is right, then there really is no such thing as justification. You can't justify an act if everything is relative. Here's what I mean. If you're going to say, well, it's relative because stealing is wrong, but if somebody's going to starve to death, it might be okay to steal. What you just did was justified an act. What you're looking for is the greater good. Oh, wait, a good means something's objectively good. So what you're saying is saving a life is more important than saving a buck, right? If someone's wealthy and has extra money kind of hoarded up, someone's dying of starvation, then the person's life is more important than their extra money. You may want to debate that from many different positions, but the reality is that's a justification. A justification depends upon the existence of justice. To justify something is to make it just or to show how it is just. And if there's no objective ethic, then justification is just language games. You don't need to say it. You don't need to say it's okay to steal to save somebody from starving, but it's not okay to steal otherwise. That's an objective ethic. So if you try to justify things, understand you're doing objective ethics, or else you're playing a language game and you just need to stop because it's pointless anyway. It doesn't matter. If ethics are relative, it really doesn't matter why you stole. You just stole. Okay, well, and if ethics are relative, is it really even stealing? What does that mean? Take something that's not yours. Okay, you just took something, you made it yours. If there's no objective ethics and there's no justice, all there is the most powerful person gets what they want and the least powerful person doesn't. And if you have problems with that, you're an objectivist. So those are the things to keep in mind as you do this. Read that Pojman article. Think this through. Finally, we're going to be looking a little bit at religion and ethics as we look at objective versus relative ethics. There are two key religious ethical approaches. One is divine command. God sets the laws, and however he sets them is what is. There's a dilemma, there's a problem for that, a difficulty for that, and we'll talk about that some. It's called the Euthyphro dilemma. There's also natural law, which you've possibly read already, but it's in there. You'll read this week if you haven't read it yet. Thomas Aquinas talks about natural law. It's the idea that God sets the laws, but the laws come out of God's nature, and God builds these laws into the nature that he creates, human nature, the nature of the world around us, and that's natural law on some levels. There are non-religious natural law, but we're just going to look at it in the religious context, in relation and in kind of debate with divine command. Just because somebody roots their ethics, their objective ethics, in religion doesn't mean that they necessarily agree on everything. So we'll look at those two a little more closely.